I'll take a quick minute to introduce myself. My name is Jamila Sahiba. I'm a senior program manager working for a technology policy think tank called The Dialogue. We're based out of New Delhi. So I come here today to moderate this session in my capacity of a senior program manager who does a lot of work on AI, and also somebody who's driving the work at the Secretariat of the Coalition for Responsible Evolution of AI, also called Core AI, which the dialogue is the secretariat to. I'll take 30 seconds to give a little bit about what Core AI is. So Core AI is essentially a multi-stakeholder platform that we've curated, feeling the need that there were a lot of siloed conversations that were being had amongst different stakeholder groups. And we saw the need to bring all of these stakeholder groups together to use their collective expertise to sort of drive and build onto the discourse of responsible evolution of AI in India. So of course, I come here today representing the coalition. I have a few members on this panel who also happen to be a part of the coalition, including Sundar and Tanveer. So I'll take a quick second to introduce my panelists, and then I'll set some discussion house rules, and then we'll start off with the discussion. So on my left, first off, I have Monami Dasgupta. She's the head of research at D91 Labs. She essentially is working in the fintech space and will give us a little sectoral understanding of how we're looking at targeting or developing regulatory approaches to AI. Next off, we have Tanveer Hassan. He's the executive director of Center for Internet and Society. Then we have Mr. Sundar Narayan. He's an AI ethicist, has some very, very unique perspectives to bring to the table. He works for AI Tech and Ethics. And of course, last but not the least, the man who's been here since the very beginning. Today, I heard him talk in 2 panel discussions. Sir always has great insights to provide. Dr. Rakesh Maheshwari, he needs no introduction, so I'm not going to waste any time in that. So quickly, just to set the context of what this discussion's on, through this discussion, we're going to be looking at what are the regulatory approaches to AI governance. What will be important in this discussion is to sort of, and I would request all my fellow panelists to keep this in mind while maybe providing their inputs to the discussion, is that we would want to draw upon what's happening globally in the regulation space of AI. We'd also want to see how important multi-stakeholder dialogues and discussions are when it comes to any kind of regulation or the future of AI in India. And we'd also want to understand what approaches to regulation work best. We see that there's a lot happening from a risk-based perspective in Europe. We talk about principle-based perspective here in the Global South. We also have sectoral approaches being developed. So just want to get a sense on that aspect as well. And lastly, also, what impact would any kind of regulation or a policy approach on AI lead to innovation or have on innovation? What economic implications it can have, and how does it impact human rights at large? So these are the broader contours of the discussion today. And just as a house rule, I would be sort of reaching out, I think after the first round of questions itself, to get any thoughts, any questions from the room. I wouldn't essentially want to just wait for the entire duration of the discussion to kick in the questions. I think I want to make it more interactive, so feel free to sort of comment and make notes basis what the panelists are talking about, and I'd be opening the floor for inputs, thoughts, questions after every round of questions. So yeah, that's about it from the setting up perspective, the context setting. I would first like to start with you, Dr. Maheshwari. You're the senior most, and I think it will help me sort of also set a lot of the context of what we are looking at with this discussion. So I would want to understand from you, in your experience of working in as a government official, and also now with the experience in public policy at large, what are the key challenges from a government perspective do you see when we talk about regulating AI, be it from any approach, be it a risk-based approach or a principle-based sectoral approach? What are the key challenges that you see the government navigating when it comes to AI regulation?
So good afternoon. and thank you for putting this question. The space of AI particularly has changed very, very fast, and it's like a disruptive technologies. Governments conventionally, practically, are not really able to work that fast. And particularly if you have to come up with, say, certain regulations, certain law, certain rules, any such law, any such rule has to last for a reasonable time, and of course should also be current, should also be relevant. Given this kind of background, where almost every 2 months when the things are changing, naturally it will have to be a principle based approach, at least in India. I did mention in the morning that it does take time, particularly in the Indian context, to bring a law on table. Lot of consultations are required, lot of inputs are there, conflicting inputs are there. You have to take care of the startup ecosystem. You have to ensure that, most of the industry, including the Indian industry versus the global one, gets a level playing field, which normally the policy teams, normally the policy organizations outside or the big companies always tend to influence. It is in this context that I do believe that in addition to the principle-based approach, it should ideally be maybe some ground rules to be set. I do not know how exactly, because there is once again no law other than the IT Act as of today. It's not really fitting, particularly the generative AI, which is the talk of the town as of now, is not really fitting very much within the framework of the intermediary, I'll say, as an organization, and therefore the intermediary rules, the section 79 of the IT Act. Therefore, I do believe that for the time being, till such time a proper law comes up, it will have to be sort of self-regulation, promotion of self-regulation based idea. In the process, you learn as to how exactly it works, where are the loopholes, and that is where you start working on it. But simultaneously, I also do believe that whichever way the law comes or law is framed, it's not just about AI, it's also about many other emerging tech. It's also about dealing with online harms. It's also about data privacy, for which as of today we have envisaged a board to be there. But then ideally, it should become part of the larger ecosystem, the larger regulator, which in my view therefore will be the cyber space regulator. And instead of TDSAT of course will continue to function. You should once again have a cyber based appellate, in a way cyber appellate tribunal you call it, because I am not wanting to call cyber appellate tribunal because of the past, but you need to have such a structure in place to be able to regulate all existing as well as emerging, but on a much, much more agile basis, while also being a bit away from the government. That's my view.
Thank you. I think you bring a very unique perspective, and I think this is something that we've also heard about, being talked about a lot, is the principle-based approach to regulation. And I think on that note, I'd love to come to Sundar and just want to understand from you, when we talk about a principle-based approach to regulation, how do you see that sort of, catering to ethical concerns around transparency, fairness, non-discrimination, aspects like that? And to what extent do you see these principle-based approaches truly being practical, or for that matter, implementable?
Okay, thanks for this question. I'm going to zoom out back before I get into the response to this. We just need to understand how does regulation work, right? If we speak about AI regulation in the context, there are four layers. One is four contexts that we need to be very clear with. One is AI for the government, AI by the government, AI for public, bought by the government or organized by the government, or AI for public, which has no connection to the government. Right? These four has very different meanings when we speak about AI regulations. Some of them do not directly fall under AI regulations. They fall under procurement rules. Right? So we need to be very clear in terms of what distinction that we are trying to do. Second point is that regulations are very contextual to country. It is not just about principles, it's also very contextual to country. We can speak about several examples of this. For a simple thing, a US will always take their regulations only when there is a direct impact to consumers, because it's a consumer economy, right? So there is an economic understanding. Everywhere regulations are tied to economics. If you actually look at Europe, it is a welfare and health and wellness kind of environment. You will always see their regulations trying to persuade approaches which are aligned to health, wellness, and lifestyle, right? India, is there someone who can actually respond to me about what is India's style of regulation? And this has had an impact based on colonization and several invasions. No, that's a relative yardstick that you're speaking with the recent times in mind. But I'm saying, what is India's style of regulation? Style of regulation. Law and order is a common thing. India's style of regulation is audit. Right? What do we do when we actually get out of the house? We lock it, we pull the lock, clarify it, make sure that it is locked, and then go home. Check our key twice before we get out of that place. Right? This is exactly what we do in our regulations. If you actually look at our business regulations, it is completely tied to this. You will either have an oversight authority, or you will have a mechanism of audit, right? That's how our regulations work. This is how you're actually Indianizing regulations. We should not be actually looking at it just from the lens that, okay, we try to borrow regulations from other geographies, but there is a level of Indianization that comes because of this. Why does this happen, right? This is for us to contextualize our need, because we operate on principle basis. We don't always operate based on rules. That's essentially where it is not descriptive, right? It is not deterministic. It is subjective. While there are some nuances around should it be subjective or not, but that's where principles-based regulations come in, right? When we speak about the four quadrants that I actually said initially, the level of fairness impact is primarily in the third quadrant, where there is AI built for consumers by the government or through the government, right? And AI built for consumers which has no connection to the government, which is the Facebooks of the world, the Instagrams of the world, as the case may be, right? Those are the two places where you're really worried about concepts like fairness, because it will either affect eligibility of services, or it will affect the way people are getting profiled for economic needs. So that's where fairness as a context fit in. So generally speaking about risk-based approach, it does not work in Indian context because of this diversity. Second, when we speak about AI regulations, we cannot speak in isolation only on ethics and fairness, because governance of AI has multiple perspectives, which includes AI security, which includes aspects of AI safety, how safely it is used, and it also includes privacy, transparency, human oversight, and how it protects human rights. Now, all of these becomes components of this. You look at it from an ethical lens, you look at it from a legal lens, you look at it from a risk lens, right? So when I spoke about safety, now if you actually look at it, the first three quadrants have direct impact on people's safety, while the last one may or may not have, depending on how it is exploited. right? That's essentially what the government is trying to navigate through intermediary guidelines. But are they actually solving the problem in the first three quadrants? If you don't solve the problem in the first three quadrants, the last quadrant is going to be just an add-on to address only one set of problems. We didn't happen, or we didn't manage to address the Manipur issue. I'm speaking not from a political lens or the issue lens. I'm going to be touching upon one thing very core and specific. If you actually look at the timeline of events of what happened in Manipur, it actually happened because of a misinformation, fake news. But the lead time for us to address or find the fake news was 4 days. But by then, the violence had hit, the women was harmed, and the incident has exploded. So the issue that we are actually speaking about is the speed at which regulatory mechanisms can work and where to regulate what, right? So principle-based approach works for India. We will continue to be an oversight body-based, tribunal-based, or audit-based environment. That's what suits us. But what is also necessary is to look at it from this 4 quadrants perspective, because each of these quadrants have very different implications of ethics, governance, and oversight. We need to appropriately consider them. That's how I.
Thank you, Sundar, for very, very elaborately capturing the sense of it. And I think it allows me the perfect segue to come to Tanveer. And Sundar mentioned a little bit about the fairness component and how it might sort of impact the marginalized communities. I'd want to understand from you, and since you've been working in the civil society space for the longest time, how do you, and in what capacity do you see the civil society playing a critical role in ensuring that these regulations are adaptable and also sort of voice and look out for the concerns of marginalized communities? How is it that they can also equitably contribute to any discussions that are structured around framing a regulation or a policy approach towards AI?
There's a very easy answer to it, is include us, right?
But how?
That's like, the disability movement is a classic example of how things were wrong and then how they got it right. When they came up with this very powerful slogan of nothing about us without us, they were making a very political statement, right? Which is true for any movement that goes around. And I want to pick up on the question and Sundar's response where he was saying, is it practical for a regulation? I don't think laws need to be practical. It is very practical for us to jump a signal. But that's not the point. Laws need not be practical. Laws don't have to have a practicality quotient. It needs to have a high ethical quotient. That's point one. The other point that one has to reflect is, in all our conversations about AI, we tend to make it into a techno-social or a techno-legal concept. AI has long ago broken those barriers and crossed those boundaries. Now AI is a politico-social concept as well. It is an economic social concept as well. So when you're talking about a regulation, and that's where the civil society comes in, you might have the best developers and coders who will be giving you input about the tech part of it. But what is the political angle of it? What is the cultural angle of it? What is the social angle of it? I'm not saying that technologist does not have good insights, but when a civil society has put in 25 years of work or 35 years of whatever that period is, that view is equally, if not more important in that conversation. How do you intend to create a law? How do you intend to create a structure that is not complete in its philosophy? You're talking about a principle-based approach. That principle has to be complete, right? I'll give you another example. I'm just picking on Sundar's example of the 4 quadrants. If you look at the other 4 sectors that involve in policy making, clearly there is state. State is a very, very important component. The next big component, and particularly in the AI governance, is the tech. Tech has so much of things. It does development, it does deployment, then there is business, then there is analysis. Now, those 2 sectors are fairly well represented. You will find enough conversations happening, enough roundtables, enough meetings happening. The third place is the research, which is broadly, say, academia, the intellectual community, individual researchers. It's very heartening to know that even those conversations are going on. The last quadrant, so to say, is the civil society. Where is the civil society in the AI conversations? You would find one Center for Internet and Society. You would probably, inSIG probably is also picking up these questions. But the rest of the civil society, how many organizations do we know that conduct blood donation camps? that conduct, let's say, awareness camps against health and hygiene. How many organizations do we know that does anything around AI ethics, AI audit? How many organizations, how many civil society have we known or have we set up or have we put together that talks about digital rights as a question? Not tech policy. Tech policy, there are enough organizations that are doing. Digital rights as a question, as a philosophy of comprehension. So to come back to your question, the answer is not how does civil society work with these regulations. The answer is how does the regulation or how does the regulatory authority involve the civil society? And that is from the initial stages. In the first meeting of the conversation, when you're talking about a 3-page code, there might be a civil society representative who might not understand anything about the code, but that's not the point. The point of inclusion is not expertise. Inclusion is not equal to expertise. Inclusion is equivalent to representation and the principle of representation. So the civil society has to be represented. Tomorrow there might come a point when the 3-page code or the 5 tools that you have developed might have zero social relevance. That's when the civil society will come in and say, hey, this is the experience. These are the case studies. These are the models. This is what we have learned. So, yeah, thanks.
Very, very interesting. And I think I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will have inputs on that. But before we come to that, I would want to step back a little bit and maybe get into the fintech space and bring Monami into the discussion. We were talking over tea, Monami, that how AI is transforming the space of finance and how rapidly it's sort of being integrated into through different services and use cases. I'd want to understand from you, what type of regulatory adaptability do you believe is necessary to sort of balance innovation? Something that Dr. Maheshwari also pointed about, it's important to sort of not curb the innovation that's happening in the space. So what do you think, what is this adaptability that the regulation should aim to achieve when it comes to sort of ensuring a fine balance both between innovation and between risk management and other fintech related issues that we see very heavily already being regulated in the space?
Right. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Before I start about talking, about AI and regulations, we need to really take a step back and understand that finance and fintech is very heavily regulated by a lot of, apex bodies, RBI, SEBI, IRDA, all of it. When it comes to AI, we are still figuring out how do we do this in the best manner so that the last person in the economy or in the group is not harmed, because when these innovations happen, they happen at scale and they happen very quickly, right? So a quick background of myself, the reason I'll tell you why I'm including it, that I come from a financial inclusion space and then kind of broadened my area to fintech. So there's always a lens to look at what is the last mile person's life being impacted by various innovations. So now coming back to how should the regulation look for when we are building AI for fintech? Definitely we will need to balance for innovation and risk. And I have certain, notes to kind of, remind myself of what do we want it to look if we have given the task of, hey, tell me what the fintech space regulation characteristics should be, right? So one of the things that is very important is transparency and explainability, right? Let's say there's a fintech X and they are kind of using AI tools to do, the algorithm trading or fraud detection or the likes of risk-prone activities. There needs to be a regulation which can hold them accountable and say, hey, explain to me what is the exact backend formula you've used to generate these kind of results. Once you're able to explain, you automatically start also being transparent. They also need to kind of be able to report what was the intended purpose of using the algorithm that they have, tried to use. The other thing, what we also need to understand that when we create AI for fintech outcomes, we also need to stress test it in environments that might happen once in a blue moon, but can create a lot of havoc if it happens, whenever it happens, right? So those models need to be stress tested prior to time. There needs to be regular audits of those models to see how robust they are. And there's obviously everybody in this room is probably familiar, but I'm just reiterating it so that we don't forget, is there is always going to be a fear of bias when we are talking about AI, and that kind of extends to the financial use case also. Fintech finance will use data that is personal, private, that is also says a lot about your socioeconomic background. And if it is used in the wrong way, it can cause a lot of harm, a huge extent of harm. So that is why it is very important to be careful about, there is no specific, rule out bias, mitigate bias as much as we can. Some of the tools that can help to create regulatory adaptability is obviously sandbox. So when you have sandbox, when you put your ideas within the sandbox, the fear of things failing really gets controlled. It is a controlled environment. You can test out, you can fail, and then you can see if it is working, it will work out in a real economy or not. There's somebody in the last role play session also said about proportional regulation, and that extends to finance as well. Riskier the activity, ideally there should be more proportional regulation around it. And also the aspects of fairness, ethical consideration will extend to this. We have to understand that the biggest merit that AI can have in fintech and finance, as I stated previously, is reaching the scale of India's population. So for instance, if I have to give an example, that if somebody is thinking of using AI for credit underwriting, for people who are not in finance, I'll take a second. What that means is, whenever you give a loan to somebody, you underwrite that person, you try to assess, is the person risky in terms of, will the person be able to repay the amount, and does the person have the ability to repay the amount? And you want to do the credit analysis, you use their credit score, etc. Now imagine AI comes in the picture. We'll have to be very careful as well as thankful that AI can do it at scale, multiple underwritings in an hour. It can do a month's worth of work or even more. But we have to be careful of the bias that it may have. There could be a bias where the physical, like actual financial institutions, might not have lent to certain small region in UP because they feel that they don't want to, lend to that particular area for whatever reasons, and that will get duplicated in the algorithm that you use, right? So be very careful about how AI can actually backfire when it is not taken care of. So I'll pause here, but this is generally the kind of thinking that I think we can start about imagining how the regulations in the fintech space will shape.
Thanks, Manami. I think you very nicely. Yes, Sundar.
I have a reflection to share. I think Tanvir brilliantly put it out, and Monami also brought that. The thing is, when we speak about specifically financial inclusion, I'm going to give you two examples of what happens in financial services in general, right? One is a concept called homophily. It's a behavioral economics concept. You should, if you don't know it, you should read about it. So essentially, it's the concept of birds that flock together, stay together kind of thing, right? So what they basically do is they use this to identify possible fraudulent customers. So the way it happens is that they can access to your messages, you consent to it, and the messages or your contacts are used as a basis to assess if you have a lot of numbers that are generally considered as fraudulent and you have them in your contacts, you are considered to be someone who is associated to that particular group. Now, this is a very stupid logic. Reason, for a person like me, I actually store a lot of these as spam to enable Truecaller to limit spamming others. Now, what happens? I've saved them as spam. It is in my contacts. They are not really bothered about whether it is stored as spam or Sundar. What they are really bothered about is there in your contacts. Now, what we are actually missing out is causality. Now, you see the element of bias that it can produce because of just this, right? There's another example that I want to give you. LGBTQ. India recognizes the rights of LGBTQ, right? Go to any bank today, any financial institution today, ask for an application, see if the gender as an option has other genders as options. They don't even collect the data. If the data is not collected, they don't have the data. If they don't have the data, they're training their model on their data. If they're training their model on the data is biased, the model is biased.
Flawed.
This is absolutely flawed, right? So, yeah, so that's fundamental. There's another factor that I want to actually give you. We use a lot of language models these days, right? Some of them are trying to improve it, but you can still go and try it with many of the existing language models, which are really poor with this. It's the point on what Tanvir said in terms of inclusion. Go ahead and go and search for complex mathematical equation, copy that equation, put it on any of your preferred kind of language model, and then ask it to explain to a person with disability. It'll basically say, it'll be very difficult for a person with disability to understand a complex mathematical equation. What the hell? It's not cognitive disability. Physical disability and cognitive disability are not distinguished. And that's the reality of many of the AI systems. I'm not trying to say AI systems are always bad. I'm just saying if we don't include the right people, we will never have a perspective. We are all limited by perspectives. What we're actually speaking about is how by being limited by perspectives, you can just lose out on a whole group. And we are currently in the world of where the models are trained on the model responses, not on human responses. Human data trained on AI models. Now we are training AI models on AI data. So, which means we're going to exasperate a lot of bias through that. And that's where not just regulations, not just rules, sectoral interventions are required. How can RBI try to put this as part of their principles? They did attempt it, but it didn't move anywhere. We even approached them to see how we can support them in shaping up how they need to define bias. It didn't move anywhere. I'm just saying these are considerations one need to take into account. So regulations are not just central level regulations. It is going to be much more detailed as rules and also about guidelines from sectoral regulators in different ways. And these are not going to be unified guidelines. I'll not be surprised if we get to see a bunch of regulatory requirements which are not just regulations, more or less like tax regulations for emerging technology in general. That's the wave that we will get to in next 5 to 10 years. That's what I wanted to say. Sorry.
Perfect. No, Sundar, I think by those examples, you paint a very vivid picture of how biases can truly infiltrate. And by using some real life examples, I think it also gives us a lot of perspective in our ability to understand this. And before I sort of get into the second round of questions with the panelists, I would want to invite any thoughts, any questions from the audience on whatever you've heard so far. I would love to take 2 to 3 questions and then I will move on to the second round. Yes, please. Mike, could the team help us?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the great discussion so far. It is pretty well documented that we do not understand the inner workings of these AI systems. They are black boxes. On an interpretability level, we are 1 or 2 generations behind in terms of understanding how these models function. Given that, after an audit, what do you want to do? Like, what is your action step? You can't exactly go into the model and say, oh, delete this model weight or delete this bias. And retraining is obviously like too much of a burden. So what exactly is it that you would want to do after an audit or after stress testing through a sandbox?
Lovely. Does anyone want to take that?
I think one thing, I mean, this is not holistic, obviously, there could be multiple other steps, but I would also think kind of expanding the base of data sets that go in the LLM model or in the, creation of the AI model could help, because the more data that you have, obviously for each data set, you have to check for bias in either independently or at a, collective but standard way. But the more data sets that you include, you go away from the bias of this is a geographical specific data, which is now expanded to kind of fit the whole thing. So maybe that could be one solution that you come across after you found a bias or if you found a loophole into the model. Anyone else?
I'll give you a cheeky response and then probably try to be a little more serious. The LLM models that we know as black boxes is not because they're black boxes by design. It is because they are not disclosing data. Stanford put together an entire directory of what are the parameters to have an open LLM. And surprise, surprise, the most open LLM that we have is by Facebook. Right. So it is not that the black boxes, the LLMs are as black boxes by design. It is simply because nobody has asked for that data in a persuasive manner. So the cheeky response is, if it is a black box and if there is bias, then don't use it. If you know that it is a bad investment, why do you want to keep investing in that bad investment? But the more serious response is, it's not just about the bias that Sundar was pointing out. When a system overtakes reasonable bias, it actually goes towards being flawed. And flawed systems that have larger responsibilities such as governance, such as financial safety, such as socio-political discourse, are not good for any setup, whether it is democratic, whether it is something else. So, having said that, if you look at the way that some of these parameters for transparency around AI is happening, around LLM is happening, the question that you're asking is a very important question that a lot of researchers are asking. People have been very continuously and very persuasively asking these companies to release the data. And you will be surprised, there are 3 parameters. I can share the link with you later. There are 3 different processes that they identify. There is an upstream process, and then there's a downstream process, and there's something called a building process, if I'm not wrong. So the most of the data that is available is in the downstream process, which is easy to understand because that's where most of the regulations are. The upstream process and the building process is what companies see and what builders or big tech sees as their IP, their cognitive abilities and their technological ability. This is where there's no data. The downstream, there is enough and more data. So the bias that we are now talking about is also 1/3 of our analysis. Imagine what happens when we have all of these sets of data.
I just want to clarify, interpretability is not such a big challenge. We are not 2 generations away. The basic difference is there are models where inherently interpretable models are complex to build. There are models where they are inherently interpretable. You see what I'm saying? So basic regression models that you're able to develop, which is an extension to your statistical modeling, can still happen and it will be fairly representative in terms of explainability. We don't have a challenge, right? That's only the second part where we are actually looking at deep learning models. That's where the complexity of interpretability comes in. Even in deep learning, if you go to real world applications, you see many organizations are still not there in deep learning adoption, so much so that it would have a significant impact. I'm sure in the spaces that you see, there is a lot of adoption of deep learning. For example, if you see social media, there is a lot of adoption of deep learning. But if you actually go into financial services, you will realize that the extent of deep learning adoption is only in pockets. In many other pockets, they are actually running regression models. So interpretability cannot be generally categorized to say that they are not inherently interpretable. I just wanted to clarify that stand to say that it doesn't mean that if I use a ML model, it will definitely not be interpretable. That's not the reality.
I quickly want to just make a comment. So I think this is where the technical side and the policy side need to communicate a little bit more. This 1 or 2 generation statement which I made, this is not coming from me. This is coming from the head of mechanistic interpretability at Google DeepMind, which is Neil Nanda. And he has kind of categorically stated that we do not even run experiments, in fact, of understanding how these models run today, because it is just very hard, and the current models we run are just toy models at GPT-2 and GPT-3 levels. That's one. And the second thing is, I'm afraid we are getting a little bit too hung up on the data bit, because it's not just about data. A lot of these models, they exhibit very obvious emergent behaviors, things that we are not trained on, things that they're not trained for. There's something called grokking. So as soon as you release a model into the world, it learns from its environment. And it gets better at things, or it develops capabilities or abilities which it just did not in the regulatory sandbox or when you were auditing it. And this is, I think, a thing which regulators should think about. It's becoming more and more powerful with GPT-4 and all of these things. This is why these companies have to keep fine-tuning, keep safety testing these models. But yeah, I'm happy to also take this conversation offline and share some of the interpretability links, because they are based in very, very fundamental technical concepts, since this is all a stochastic process when it comes to training the models and so on. Yeah.
Do we have any more? Do we have?
Hello. Hello, sir, ma'am. My name is Priyambada. I wanted to ask that we were talking about the principles here in India still have a colonial hangover, right? So, not exactly a colonial hangover, but we treat our principles that way. So, I wanted to have your opinion on how do you think like India's current governance system needs a complete overhaul, or is it just an implementation issue?
Looks like it's a misunderstanding. I wanted to clarify. I do not say it's a colonial hangover. What I'm trying to say is we don't altogether borrow regulations as such. We Indianize them. That's what I say, right? When we Indianize them, we try and structure them for what works in the contextual environment, right? That's where I spoke about the audit mechanism, the oversight mechanism, which is very different from some of the other mechanisms that exist in the West, right? So that's what I said. I wouldn't say that it requires any overhaul. It requires an evolution. Now, overhaul and evolution are very different concepts altogether. We're only speaking about an evolution. Evolution more at the pace, more from an inclusion perspective, more that can help in on-ground integrations. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
See, any principle-based approach primarily means that you write minimum into the law. You write only the principles, maybe define the contours of how exactly they will be implemented, and thereafter leave it to the subordinate legislations to develop around it, which actually gives you the flexibility to tackle one day-to-day kind of issue or frequent issues. And two, the law continues to be technology agnostic reasonably and hence has a longer life.
The best example is constitution.
Yes, exactly.
Can I? Yeah. So when there was an emphasis on how the political and ethical angle of AI has been like undermined, like I can't emphasize enough how I've been like longing to speak about this. I just want the perspective, like as civil society representative just spoke. Enough emphasis has been given to acknowledge the fact that there's been not so enough like representation of ethics part of AI that's been given in the ecosystem. But what are the means that we can employ to actually make it more representative and truly make it multi-stakeholder approach?
I'll try. Representation is not easy. Let's begin with that. Okay, and
Not definitely in India.
yeah, I mean,
It's very difficult.
so whoever did the inSIG program, I'm sure you would have found it very difficult to balance a panel, right? So even at the level of the panel, just bringing 5 people together, it's already difficult. Now you're talking about AI. You're talking about something that we have not even, like you rightly pointed out, the gentleman who asked the question, which is at a very evolving phase. So what do you represent? Do you represent business? Do you represent society? Do you represent law? Is business then devoid of law? Is then society independent of law? Aren't there Venn circles and Venn diagrams that we are already overpopulating and co-creating? So it's an extremely difficult question to ask. But I have 2 principles when I made that statement. The first principle is, it's the future. So people who are present today and who have the conversation should actively look for people who are not in the conversation. Which means that today if Center for, and I'll only take the civil society example. If it means that today if Center for Internet and Society is sitting in this conversation and asking for representation, if there is a follow-up panel, I don't think Center for Internet and Society should be in this panel. There should be another civil society organization. So it's that level, right? The future. The second one is a little difficult to explain, but I'll bear with me. It is the principle of subsidiarity, which means that yes, the best of the AI might come to me from, I don't know, from the Google headquarters, Delhi, or some other lovely lab. But the decision should not be only people who are building it. It should also be people who, at the lowest end of it, are working with that example. And this is very well established in the way that we have set up our criminal justice system. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but the principle of subsidiarity is there. It is the common denominator that one has to work with, not the factor of excellence. And this is something that we push back in every single conversation that we have about AI. AI is not about who is excellent in doing something. AI or conversations about AI has to be representative at the level of what is the common denominator of conversation. So these are the two principles that we carry when we talk about inclusion. Will it always work? I'm not sure. But is this a good start or is this a start? I think fairly yes.
Thank you.
So we'll hold the questions for now. We'll have another round of questions after the second round of questions that I posed to the panelists. So please bear with me. I'd like to come to Dr. Maheshwari again. And this is a question that I would want thoughts from all the panelists. I mean, when we talk about balancing innovation with regulation, what are the potential mechanisms? Because, and I asked this in the context of that at some point we were hearing that there might be some regulation on AI from a user harms perspective in the now potentially scrapped Digital India Act. And then we had a series of advisories that came out, which again were, for the lack of a better word, put out in a very shady manner. There were there was no public announcement of the same, and there were clarifications being sought on Twitter, now called X. And we now also hear that the government is working towards constituting an AI safety institute, much on similar lines of what's happening globally. So I just want to understand, when we talk about any sort of regulation on AI and the need to balance innovation and what the future holds in that capacity, what mechanisms and what means should the government essentially involve and engage in to ensure that the two are balanced? And also, how is it that all kind of stakeholders, I see that there's a lot of need to understand how different stakeholders can truly come in and contribute to make a real difference. So what is it, in your experience of working as a government official, do you think are some mechanisms that can be leveraged towards that?
The government per se, any serious regulation particularly, is always brought in with a consultative process. It's possible that maybe we do not go through, not able to go through, or maybe do not agree on all the points which have been given, but that does not mean that we do not want to. Maybe sometimes we don't even understand. Capacity issue can always be there, and that's a very practical kind of a scenario. I mean, please bear with me. So by law, there is a requirement that you need to consult. By practice, there is a consultative process which goes on. Certain things which will always be, say, bias of the people, particularly because government's overall objective always remains that, as was mentioned by Tanvirji, that maybe you are trying to look at it from safety perspective, from security perspective, from national security perspective. So maybe business takes a back seat. Maybe many other things may take a back seat, but then to the extent the government executives understand the issue, they try to build all those things in. Yes, because of conflicting scenarios, sometimes certain things do get give up. And then there has to be a political consensus also. At the end of the day, it is the political boss who must agree to any rule making process, any law making process, even within the government, even within your own ministry, in your own department, your own political bosses must agree to it. And to that an extent, from my side, I'm deviating from your question. I do believe, particularly on the aspects like AI, that there is also a question of, and there is a need of capacity building in the government as well, to understand the nuances, to understand the harms, the benefits, the way it will work, and all such aspects to make the process of law as much as logical as possible. And to that extent, that's why many a time I have been advocating that particularly on such technologies, it's better that we constitute an expert group right in the beginning, bring in all sorts of people, including the civil society, and maybe we thereafter manage it through the regulator to particularly develop the subordinate legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would want to hear everybody's thoughts on the same question. In what ways, again, I don't want to repeat, but I'm sure.
So quickly, there's nothing called balance. There is relative balance, relative contextual balance. There is nothing called balance. So it is only at the use case level. So to simply put this in a, I'm going to borrow your words, cheeky way, none of us will have a balanced life. Right? None of us will have something called balance. It is only relative scale, right? So I want us to look at it from a relative scale. So innovation is not going to get hurt by a regulation if we look at it from a relative scale. There is no generalized regulation that's going to impact innovation. That's a bad idea, and that's not what we should be actually looking at. That's what I wanted to say. It's only a relative scale. So if there are use cases where the innovation will harm, hurt, or cause distress, you look at cutting off that innovation, right? On the other side, if it's going to prosper, progress, and then provide more opportunities, you look at overcoming that limitation. So it's a relative scale, not a generic scale.
Let's break the order. It's becoming too much of a classroom.
I'll stick to my area of understanding, definitely not expertise. But when it comes to fintech, so the framework that I'm thinking about right now in my head is there is AI models helping fintech take certain decision, and then there is regulation. Unfortunately, in the space of fintech, a lot of regulations has been very reactive. Some institution has gone big with certain products, certain strategies, and after a 4-year timeline, 3-year timeline, the regulator feels that, hey, this is not something we agreed upon. This is not something this particular product should have been used as, or there is creative interpretation of the RBI regulation that, for example, the entire PPI ban that happened a few months back. And this happens every now and then. If you create like a timeline, this happens every now and then. So I think if I, from a product perspective, from a fintech space perspective, if I say, sometimes, yes, regulation can harm innovation, and the best way to go about is definitely have a consultative approach to be a little proactive about how you understand the space. Unfortunately, AI fintech is happening at such a breakneck speed that a lot of people in the traditional world of finance does not capture or understand what's going on in the space. We jokingly at our workspaces call this the Delhi versus Bangalore problem. By the time the idea moves from Bangalore to Delhi, it's kind of lost in translation, right? So, but there is a requirement, and I think Rakesh sir at the beginning pointed out the role of SRO. It's very important that there are self-regulatory authorities who understand the space, represent the fintech space to the regulator on a regular basis, and make them understand that this is the kind of innovation that's going to be that's going to use AI to reach scale and reach masses. This is how it's being built in an ethical manner, and this is where you should now think about that. If you had to regulate, do it now. Instead, not do it 3 years later when people have already started using that product, are reaping the benefits from it, but suddenly you realize that, hey, this is not what I allowed, right? So little bit more proactive than reactive is, I think, would be the first step to take when it comes to fintech and AI regulations.
Thanks. I'm going to say some scandalizing things now. Yeah. The first thing is, I don't think innovation and regulation is a binary. So let's start with that. This is my personal opinion, and you and I agree on this, right? Because what does a binary do? A binary forces you to get stuck. You're here or there, right? Let's take the whole idea of digital literacy. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there was this concept of the born digital native. Has this term come across, have you come across this term? There was something called a digital native and a non-digital native, things like that. At that point, that was the only spectrum that was visible, that you are either a digital native or you not. But then suddenly many hybrid conversations start coming about where you know the tech part of it, but you don't know the social part of it. To use a very simple example, the decision making of a middle class Indian household is a classic example of what tech solutionism works like. The 18 to 25-year-old has the best knowledge about what mobile phone to buy, what features to pick up, but definitely does not have the finance to support it. But the person who has the finance and who takes the decision does not have the knowledge to work with that sector, but yet we coexist, right? We somehow, the son gets, if the son is or the daughter is asking for an iPhone, we settle with something else, which is still able to open your email, do your social networking, also play some games and do X, Y, Z. So there is inherently something that is between the binary that we are creating of innovation versus regulation or regulation vis-a-vis innovation. That seems to be the spirit of the AI. If that spirit of the AI can be more emphatic, I think we have all our answers there. We don't have to always go to a regulatory authority to find what are the next steps. Some of these things, some of these hybridities that I would like to call, did not come because there was a regulator or not, but it came because the sector was so very energetic. I think that is the focus, not who is the regulator or how much should we regulate at this point.
Interesting. Do we have any thoughts on that? Okay. So, yes.
Yeah, maybe before we conclude at least, or maybe we take up the questions, I'll also like to make just one request, and that is whether it is the developer or the deployer, particularly most of us will turn out to be deployers, we must develop an AI policy, AI use policy. If we have already got one, maybe have a look, have a review, not the audit, but a review to understand. And that's where probably it must make a balance between the innovation, which is what an innovation and maybe the productivity that overall it should enhance, and maybe prevent misuse also of this technology within the office. And the same thing is also applicable with respect to the developer organizations, that they must also, and they already now have, but that their policy must ensure that they are working towards the responsible, fair, explainable, whatever good words are there, including good amount of testing before the product is released. And in spite of that, putting a disclaimer that it may be throwing in some cases results which may not suit, which are otherwise logically incorrect. And to that an extent, a component of critical thinking should always be used before action is taken based on the algorithm, based on the output which has been produced.
So when you talk about the AI policy, do you mean voluntary code of conducts that the industry and the ecosystem at large can develop?
Industry can develop, but finally the organization needs to have.
Okay.
Which can include, let's say, for example, schools
and
colleges,
all sort of AI users.
And all of them will have a different purpose because of the audience that they serve.
Correct. Do we have any thoughts in the audience on this? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Anita Walker. So my question is, because a lot of the tech that you're talking about is what is currently there, but my question is, I'm curious about, you must have seen the Tesla Optimus. It's walking, it's able to break an egg. So artificial super intelligence is not very far away, So my question is actually, have you thought of it as from the defense side? Because governments will protect their citizens, but for example, hypothetically, Tesla finally ends into maybe it's not, Tesla Optimus goes into market where you can customize it. Okay, and one country has taken it and made an army of soldiers. So then India will think, okay, they've got it, so I got to defend. So are those things coming into regulation where it becomes like governments going against each other with AI tech? Like literally it's like the doomsday kind of a scenario. So is that also being regulated? Because that's very, very possible. I really had goosebumps when I saw it breaking the egg. Because definitely super intelligence is very close.
Anybody on the panel would like to? Yes.
Have you heard of Talon's manual? Talon's manual. So maybe, I mean, certain code of conduct, even in war, even in peace, is made. And that should exist in the countries. I mean, whether you agree, I mean, whether you follow or not, but those are the conventions which come at play, and which is how I believe fairness and misuse shall be, I mean, fairness will be maintained and misuse will have to be prevented. Rest is, of course, on sandboxing basis, on experimental basis, which is fine.
I think
Beyond that,
no, AI in defense is a very tricky territory on its own, and I'm sure there are conversations being had. I mean, if Dr. Maheshwari doesn't know, I don't think I would, or anybody in the room would. But I think. Okay, I think the.
for the sake of fairness, unbiased.
The society is biased, which is why AI is biased.
I just, yeah, I'll just quickly comment on this since I'm pretty engaged with the lethal autonomous weapon systems discussions which are happening at the UN. So there are a couple of countries which want a ban, a blanket ban on the use of autonomous weapons. I'll not name the countries, but there are a few countries, and they are the usual suspects who do not want this to go through. And this comes from primarily, the kind of drone usage, and there's a complete kind of like host of problems which come into the space, which are being discussed at the UNODA. The Secretary General of the UN is very vocal about the fact that there needs to be an international treaty on this. And the current first committee, which is going to sit next week onwards, is also going to talk about it. The biggest concern from a kind of civil society organization or a youth organization perspective is that this opens the doors to, and I'm sorry to use the word, genocide, right? Some sort of emergent behaviors come across. There might be bias in the data sets. There's obviously loss of accountability because you don't really know who in the military chain of command to kind of hold accountable if an AI system just does something which you did not expect it to do. Yeah, I can talk a lot more about this, but for the sake of fairness, I'll just stop.
Hi, my name is Shivakumar Dakshinamurthy. I have a specific question. So since morning, we are keep hearing the whole spectrum of law, bill, act. So many things are there, and also I see this. It's not exactly going and bidding, sitting on the one side of it. It is intersection is lot more. There's a gaps. How practically it is going to be easy to implement it? I'm just looking at it is all implementable, executable. There is a practical challenge. What are your thought on this? Actually, while we have lot many law and areas, practicality point of view, can you just throw some light on it, sir?
Ask the same question for drug discovery and then say, why are you testing it? Give it to us, we will consume it. Don't do testing.
Anybody from that side?
There's one gentleman who's been waiting for a very long time. Okay.
That's what already they are doing.
This is otherwise something, I mean, which
Hello.
that's where I said governments also need to be capacity needs to be built so that any act which is developed should be doable, enforceable, monitorable. Otherwise, it remains a piece of paper. And precisely, I think that's the reason the DPDP rules have taken their own sweet time.
Can I just say one quick thing before? I'll go back to what I said earlier. I don't think law should be practical. The concept here is not practicality that we should be discussing. The concept here is public good. Is it for public good? If it is for public good, implementability and practicality are two different things. There are many laws that do not sound practical to us, but you can implement. That is the whole setup that we have done. That is the justice system. That is the executive system that we have built. So to talk at a level of practicality, is this practical to me, might be the equivalent of saying it will only work for me. So the question here is always, is it for the public good? Capital P, capital G. If that test, whatever that litmus test is, if we can clear that, then it will definitely happen with us.
Hello, my name is Carl, and I have a question. I just want to know your opinion, specifically on the integration of AI and also digital gig economy. So since 2018, since COVID, a lot of people have subscribed to gig economy, and we have seen a lot of integration in terms of like digital economy, and a lot of people are trying to make it as a profession. But of course, with the integration of AI, there's a lot of regulations. So my first question is, how these regulations conforms to maintain the benefits of gig economy to the workers? That's the first one. Second, with the emerging of AI in this gig economy, my question is, to what extent it is sustainable as a career? Yeah, thank you.
I'm not an expert on any of this, but the the organization that I work for has done a lot of work on digital labor and digital economy. And that's the only position that I'm taking. Whether it is sustainable or not, nobody knows. And because there has been this massive tumultuous earnings, or say, let's just call it the income ratio, which has changed as much as the Sensex has changed. So there is no guarantee about it. But something is for sure, that employment practices are moving towards AI. I'm not saying employers, I'm making a distinction here. I'm not saying that I as an employer will only have AI interview bots to bring in people. I'm not saying that. But employment practices are now becoming more and more AI focused, which means that the previous question that we picked up, which is the digital skills, are no longer optional. Whether you want to get into a role as somebody who works in a security agency or somebody works in a researcher in a research organization, digital skills have now become the common minimum threshold. And the easiest way to enter digital skills is AI. A lot of people, when I'm into some peer-reviewed journals and everything where we review, we find the abstract to be written only using AI. Not that they can't do it by their own. The researchers can put it together, which they did, say, 3-4 years ago. But now that's the changed scenario. So I don't have a good answer to your question. The two trends that we have been identifying is that a lot of employment practices are moving towards AI, and the digital skills threshold is much higher than what it was pre-COVID. And that's where probably AI will play an important role.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, panelists. My name is Deepika, and I'm from the Data Security Council of India. So my question is directed to Mr. Maheshwari. So when in the beginning of this discussion, you mentioned that there should be a separate regulator or some sort of body only for cyber. So that got me reminded of this entity which used to exist, the Cyber Appellate Tribunal, which was unfortunately merged with the TD-SAT, which is why you see even in DPDPA, we have to rely on the TD-SAT now for adjudicatory decisions. And so since you were the senior director at MeitY around 2017 when this merger happened, I was always puzzled and curious to know why the regulator took that step to merge TD-SAT and the Cyber Appellate Tribunal. Thank you.
So when I say regulator, it is not with respect to the Cyber Appellate Tribunal. Cyber Appellate Tribunal is one of the component. Otherwise, on a day-to-day basis, something like what we have try in communications, telecommunications and broadcasting is what we need to have in cyberspace, for cyberspace. Unfortunately, try, in my own belief, and I can be wrong, because the entities which they regulate, otherwise try can also be the model. They are basically on licensing basis. So they are conditioned to work in a different kind of an environment, while the cyberspace and the technology there are, the industry that is in, it has to be much more flexible, much more technical as well, and to that an extent, and of course the issues are altogether different and in fact increasing, and that's why a separate body as a regulator, TD said, I said, for the purposes of maybe the tribunal. So the regulator is maybe one level down, but then if there is anything which is going further, I mean, as against the decision which is being taken at one layer lower, is once again the TD set is, as an organization, is having a different mindset, a different kind of expertise, and because though TD set can have as many as members, I mean, from law perspective, I hope I'm not wrong, but the fact remains that they have also not really taken up those cases which were belonging to the cyber side. Once again, we are failing on that front. So that was the reason. That was, I hope that makes it clear. Good.
Hey, good. Hi, panel. So myself, Sulav Agarwal. So in one case, we are talking about climate and sustainable development goals, right? And on the other side, we are increasingly deploying data centers, whether it be under the CBAD, or I recently heard a statement from a CEO of that's a huge company that we'll be deploying more data centers across India, right? And while that we do churn data, we use electricity. So how do you comment on the correlation on that part? And in what ways India's approach to AI governance could influence its soft power in the global arena? So that's two correlating questions.
True. And I think just to add to his question was something in my mind as well, that we recently are the outgoing chair for the Global Partnership on AI. We did the G20 summit where we also spoke about responsible AI principles. So how do you see, and India aims to sort of, at least aims to and targets to become like a big voice in the global south on AI and all kinds of emerging tech for that matter. So in the backdrop of all of this, how do you see India, what route is it going to take to become and to leverage that kind of position in the world economy? How is it that it's going to sort of, position itself when you talk about regulation? Because China is also our direct competition here. So, and it is often said that, without any regulation or without any policy approach towards AI, or for that matter, a governance framework around it, it might be difficult to position India as that voice that we're looking to become. So what are your thoughts on that?
So for every 100 words that you're generating using any generative AI model, you're consuming about half a liter bottle of water. This is the statistic, right? So half a liter for every 100 words generated. This is the reality today. There is a parallel work that's happening. How do we optimize it technologically so that we can reduce the processing and compute? There are different techniques that are being adopted there. On the other side, there is I am strongly believing that it's going to be an economic fight and not a social fight, because society will not even have a choice after a point in time. It's going to be an economic fight between, is bottled water more valuable for businesses, or is a large language model inferencing is more valuable for businesses? It's going to be a competition between two industry segments that's going to determine how we're going to contribute to environment than society really playing a role in this. It's going to be an economic battle. Society will continue to place its point of view to see how we can reduce it, but we are also the culprits in the whole process. That's what I wanted to say.
And Jamila ji, on your question, I can only have a cheeky answer. Yes, that is something, the diplomacy division of the Ministry of External Affairs does. I have never been part of it, and we best leave it to them to decide. That's it.
I'll be a little bold here. See, the thing is, if you look at the way that we have been establishing the digital public goods in India and the way that we worked with the G20, if you look at the ongoing G20 conversations in Brazil, it's not surprising that they want to borrow that model. When I say borrow, I'm not saying that it's a copy-paste model, but that's a value and that's an entire process that the rest of the world is taking note. So you already are in the soft power conversation. It's not that you have to begin now. It's not step one for us. A lot of the African nations are looking at what our digital deliverance system has been. How have we done the digital public good processes in this? So the AI conversation is not a new conversation, and I fully respect what you said, sir. It is for them to decide. I'm not the person. But it's not a new battle or it's not a new frontier. We are into that conversation about technology, about the digital delivery, about the entire conversation of what the digital ethos and the infrastructure, the DP infrastructure is.
Munami, I would actually want to bring you in here before we sort of open for more questions because we have time till 5. The finance market is global, essentially, right? So when we talk about AI in finance, how and where do you see the need for harmonization, and do you really see the need for harmonization? And do you see, if we do take fragmented approaches to this, what challenges would essentially accrue?
Sure. So there is definitely merit to harmonizing certain regulations that are used for fintech and financial, institutions. Obviously, this reduces the the barriers to enter any market. It gives you a chance to expand your market access. For instance, we often hear that the regulations in Singapore versus regulations in India when it comes to finance are quite different. In some places it's much more stricter in Singapore, in some places we are much more stricter here. So any business that's operating in both of these regions face it very difficult to kind of constantly shift and juggle between those two regions. So there is merit in standardizing regulation across economies when it comes to certain fintech innovations. Obviously, that said, and I think as Mr. Sundar also said, that when you do something for India, you'll have to understand who our end consumer is. And when you do something for any other economy, you have to understand who the last mile consumer there is. So those two are not homogeneous. So obviously there will be certain nuances to whom you're addressing, to whom are you creating the regulations for. But keeping that apart, if there are similar models, similar products for which these models are being used, with some kind of similarity between the socioeconomic background of the people that they're being used for, we can think about standardizing regulations from different kind of geographies and, even kind of borrow and help other geographies to build this up. We are at a time where we are doing this as we speak. But there is probably no precedence around, how these regulations should look like. So this is like the ripe time to kind of think about it while also making sure there's innovation.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Arvind, and I just want to have a quick premise first that we are in an age of time-based competition, right? Wherein going out in the market is more important than the quality of the product that we are delivering. And online gaming industry is a very good example for this. We have had discussions on this as well. So with this premise, not just online gaming industry, there are multiple examples of it. So I want to understand, do we as consumers, as stakeholders, as victims, or as opportunists of using AI, do we have a role to play in removing the blind spots in the existing regulations towards creating more competition agnostic laws on data privacy?
It's just for you, sir.
See, this is where the role of responsible AI comes in. See, in the long run, I mean, if you have taken the shortcut, in the long run you will fail. So, responsible AI becomes important. Having the policies put in place, the way you are doing it. So, saying that we are doing it in a responsible way is one thing, but to convey that what exactly it means to us by writing down it into the policy and implementing the policy becomes important. And that's the way it has to be taken up. Otherwise, there will be in between the kind of, I mean, the results, the kind of incidents which will come up, prompting the stakeholders to strongly voice, wrongly or rightly, but reactions will be there. So at least in this area, you do as much as you can, and then still put a disclaimer to that an extent. Beyond this, anyway, at least I don't advocate for taking shortcuts. It doesn't work.
So to your question of, putting out products that are not great and then just waiting for it to fail as you kind of go through it, there is very little incentive for the consumers or citizens to do this on a voluntary basis. People might do it out of the goodness of, will and all of that. But I think the role of regulation, it comes much prior to in the entire, kind of process. Before you put out something like this in the market, it probably shouldn't be allowed to put something out that is regulatory speaking not robust enough. Make sure that it's, going through all the checklists, make sure that it has all the, loopholes tackled, and then probably put it out in the market and see if it is going to sustain or not. If it's a bad demand, that's a different problem. But if it's a flawed product or a flawed app or flawed kind of a, gaming kind of a platform, you have your answer. I mean, it will not sustain the test of time.
There's an access question, access to the use of AI in itself. This may sound a little stereotypical, but to draw an analogy, the entire profiling, socioeconomic profiling of the people sitting in this particular room in itself is like inclined towards a particular group, like socioeconomic profiling. So I mean to say that the whole ecosystem of AI is not so accessible for the downtrodden. And for that, one thing that I thought is the lack of accessible technical education, which is inherently very costly compared to the other modes of study. Like, I mean, I'm happy that many people are getting to go into humanities and learn more about it, but to make AI more inclusive, since we are talking about inclusivity, I think a technical education could be something that could be made more accessible and cost effective for access for people in the downtrodden section. So I'd like both civil society and government representatives to speak about it and to ensure access through empowering technical education that is more cost effective.
Can I though answer? I mean, Meta AI is already doing that. You have it on your WhatsApp. It is not through education that somebody will kind of take up the use case, build up on the use cases of AI that can have. The way to kind of bridge the gap of an innovation for the, let's say, low income categories or last mile categories is to be available on the platform that they already exist on. So if they are heavily using WhatsApp, if they are heavily using Facebook, Amazon, we have AI all in all of those platforms now, and they are using it way more than even I do, because I mean I get suggested by them that, madam aap wo kar lo, I mean dekh lo, wahan pe mil jayega answer. If I have a headache, they will ask me to do that for them. So it's not technical education, and I'm saying this because even in finance we had this entire understanding of financial literacy will do good. It actually did not. Financial literacy does not do that much good. What really does good is good advisors. If the advisor is good, so it's exactly like the relationship between a doctor and a patient. When you go to a doctor, you don't know what is the kind of medication or prescription you need. You believe that their expertise will help you heal yourself or medicate yourself. It's similar to that. As a person, giving them technical education or giving them financial education will not really bridge the gap. What will bridge the gap is, one, being available on the platform near them, creating regulation that safeguard the safeguard interest of the consumer of different socioeconomic categories, and kind of being really understanding them. Like, you need to think about them when you're creating any regulation or innovation in the society. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So education is important, awareness is important, but what is also important is to have a sense of inquisitiveness towards what is it, right? I'll give you an example. Sorry, I'm going to be speaking about Meta AI. I'm sure you don't have any affiliation, I don't. Meta integrated something called No Languages Left Behind. It is called NLLB as a model which translates which can work in about 200 languages, okay, including low resource languages. Low resource means languages which have less digital content. That's what is low resource. So they directly integrated it into applications. So if you are a monolingual speaking only one language, you will see everything on Facebook or Instagram in your language. It will get auto-translated and provided to you, including news articles, right? And I did a research which actually opened up to say that those auto-translations has mistranslations leading to misinformation. So there is a level of cognition and inquisitiveness as a user that you can apply to see how you can contribute to evolving the ecosystem without even knowing the technical details and awareness of it. I'm not trying to say that technical awareness is not required. I'm trying to say inquisitiveness is more important than this. Don't blindly have cognitive bias for AI. That's more important at this stage than having awareness of AI.
I'll keep it very short. I don't agree with both Monami and Sundar. I have a very different position on this. What both of you pointed out is towards information. What technology should be doing is towards education or knowledge. Knowledge has a component of criticality. I'll give you a very simple example. Why is technology taught always in English? Will you believe me if I tell you that Pune University used to teach physics in Marathi in the 70s? Why are we not teaching physics in Marathi in Kannada anymore? When we know that humanities can be taught beautifully well, and I'm an example of it. I learned in Kannada. I learned my political science in Kannada. I learned my sociology in Kannada. If humanities can be taught in Kannada, why can't technology be taught in English? Now, somebody will say resources, somebody will say concepts. How big of a gap is it for us to bridge it? So as long as you don't bring criticality into knowledge, if that is not a conversation that you're having, then we are going to work with tool-based examples that somebody is going to translate. But who has translated it? The same people who were trained in English, right? So you are never going to have this wider spectrum of critical ability coming into it. And the last example that I want to give you is, if you remember a couple of years ago, 5-6 years ago, Google Translate had to its right hand side, if you were to translate something from English to an Indian language, and the translation would be horrible. And at the end, there was a suggest button. right? You could have, and that's exactly what you're saying. That's the inquisitiveness. But I'm saying that's not enough. The inquisitiveness is only going to take you till information. Where is the criticality coming from? The criticality has to come from an institutional position of saying that I will teach AI in English, whatever that means. I will teach AI in Sanskrit. I will teach AI in Malayalam. I will teach AI in Kannada. Now, without that kind of commitment towards critical pedagogy, all of this will remain at the level of some hacks, which are good, which are very, very helpful. But that does not answer the cognitive question at all.
No, thank you. I've been signaled that my time here is up. So I would like to thank my panelists and the audience for being super interactive. And thank you, Manami, Tanveer, Sundar, and Dr. Maheshwari for your time. This was a very fruitful discussion, both for me and hopefully for everybody in the audience. So without further ado, I would sort of leave the stage for the rest of the program to kick in. Yes.